Welcome to The Growth Project, a podcast brought to you by AMPLOS. Dr. Drew Brannon, joined today by Dr. Cory Shaffer. Dr. Shaffer, welcome to the show.
Excited to be here, Drew. What do we got today?
Well, I'm excited about today's topic, and the reason being, I know that one of the reasons I really enjoy our listening community and value our listening community is we have people who are doing a million and one different things, different industries, different places in their career, different types of aspirations. But the topic we're on today is so applicable across all of that variability. It's applicable in people's personal lives, equally applicable in their professional lives, because we're talking about the topic of pressure. So we're getting into this idea of like, what does pressure do to us? I know you're keen on this topic as well, seen it rear its face in plenty of places, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you go back at this point a lot longer than I'd like to admit, sort of on air, but being an athlete myself once upon a time, remember what this felt like, if we're talking specific to sports, but it doesn't go anywhere just because you stop playing sports. It just shows up in other areas of life. I think, there have been times in this job when I've felt, pressure and tried to, use a lot of the things that we'll talk about today in order to manage it and sort of leverage it as opposed to succumb to it. But yeah, I think pressure is such a fascinating topic. It's something that everybody probably at some point feels.
Yeah. I'm glad you mentioned that because now that just triggered, we got a couple good examples and questions I'm going to get into related to what you just said.
Okay.
Once we get going, it's always fun to audible.
Yeah. Okay.
When it comes to the podcast. All right. So let me provide at least a little bit of background and context for what got us thinking about this. I guess because of what we do professionally, we're always thinking about the variable of pressure and how we can help our clients compete at the highest level. But if you've been paying attention at all in the world of sports lately, there have been at least two, and I'm sure more, but two that we're going to touch on, examples of an athlete really feeling the weight of pressure in a moment that mattered a great deal. And so I'll introduce this first example. I'm going to let you detail this a little bit more because I feel like you're way more dialed in on this than me in golf these days. But at the Open this year, Rory didn't exactly finish well. So take us through that.
Yeah. Our listeners, many of whom probably saw this, Rory had the lead on the final day on Sunday afternoon. Really, if he just sort of sustains performance and let's just say sort of pars out, essentially, like he's going to win the U.S. Open, which would have been his first major, and probably, I don't know what the specifics of this. I'm sure one of our listeners can correct me, but it's been 9 or 10 years since he's won a major.
I did not even realize that.
Yeah, and that has been weighing on him. You can tell in the golf community, especially every year he shows up at Augusta with the opportunity to win there and sort of complete the Grand Slam, as they would call it, with all 4 majors. But specifically at the U.S. Open, like now he literally has victory like in his grasp. He just needs to sort of coast into the finish line and just play like he can play. And in the final couple of holes, he missed a few putts inside of like 4 feet, I think it was, when prior to this, all season, he had been something like 495 out of 495 on putts inside like 4 feet. And
really,
in the final, I think 3 holes,
know that either.
In the final 3 holes of the U.S. Open, with victory sort of within his grasp, he missed 2 of them.
Wow. Which is, and just to provide a little background there, that's a 90%-ish putt for PGA Tour players?
4 feet.
Close to 90.
I think the statistics are probably 90%. I can't recall the specifics, but yeah, they're it's pretty high. And I mean, he was 100% to that point, and then his final couple holes, missed a few putts. Now, obviously, in this case too, him sort of, I guess, to throw out the word, choking, like he kind of choked in the situation. Yeah. Credit to Bryson DeChambeau, who played really, really well down the stretch and had to make a couple of just awesome shots in order to win. But just, it seems outside looking in, the narrative coming afterwards, especially how Rory ended up responding, didn't stick around to congratulate DeChambeau, didn't talk to the media. Essentially, it sort of just looked like
kind of pouted.
He choked.
Yeah.
And then he just, sort of turned inward and shelled up and just didn't want to talk about it. He comes out a couple days later with, just like a statement online, but it sure looked like the pressure got the most of him.
Yep.
Because you have to imagine all of that just weighing on him. And, as we know, the closer you get to the finish line in something like that, the more you start looking ahead to the outcome. And I can only imagine what that may have done to him mentally, emotionally, physiologically, some of the things we'll talk about today.
Right. I mean, given the stats that you went through there, I don't know how you argue any other theory than pressure got involved in that.
Yeah.
Now, was he going to miss one of those putts eventually at some point in the career from that, or in the season from that distance? Well, sure. But it's not coincidental that two of them happened in that scenario. So we have that example. The other one I'll offer just quickly here occurred over the weekend. I happened to be walking through my house, and one of my kids and my wife were watching the Wimbledon women's final, which was won by, I'm going to do my best on this, Barbora Krejcikova.
Very well done.
The odds are she won't hear this to correct me.
That's my guess.
Although she's welcome to, and we would love for her to be listening to the Growth Project. But she was trying to win Wimbledon. It's third set, and I happened to catch like the last couple games because I heard from across the room, I kept hearing my wife say, "Oh my gosh, she's choking so bad." You can hear that.
But there's context here too, in that your wife,
she's
tennis is her thing.
She was very good and knows tennis well. So she's like, "Oh my gosh, she's choking so bad." And so I go in there, and it was incredible. You could literally see it all over her face. You could see it on her face. You could tell by the decisions she was making, the types of balls she was hitting. And now, to her credit, she found a way to make it happen. And so she won. But there was a steep drop-off in performance, which, again, is normal for a person who's trying to win Wimbledon for the first time. Because even if you know nothing about tennis, you've at least heard of Wimbledon. Like, it's the one to win. It's the Masters of tennis. So we've got these two examples. And what we want to talk about today is essentially, like, what's going on there? And we want to drill down deeper than we would commonly do just by like making the easy low-hanging fruit observation of this person let the pressure get to them. Like, let's get into it deeper than that. That's really kind of where we're headed today.
I think I mentioned from the outset, we don't want you to turn off the podcast if you think we're just talking about sports, because
correct.
This does apply to all of us, regardless of what industry you're in. And so I'm sure even as we describe some of this, you're going to be able to resonate with it. Yeah. So hang with us, because as we talk about just what pressure's doing, we will get to a point to where we can talk about what you can do about it.
Yeah, great qualifier, because I don't know that anyone who's listening to this is going to be trying to win a major title in either tennis or golf, but I know this. There are plenty of people who have a significant presentation to make. You've got a sales goal to hit. You've got mouths to feed. You have a new boss who isn't so sure about you. There's pressure everywhere. And so we're speaking to you as we kind of get into this. So, Cory, let's start here. So much of the way pressure takes a hold of a human being stems from what we call kind of their appraisal of it, or another way to say that would be their perception of it. So get into that a little bit along the lines of like when we say the perception factor of this and the role of perception. Let's start there.
Yeah, so I usually always start by using the phrase that everybody has heard this at some point or another, but beauty lies in the eye of the beholder. And what that means, of course, is that it's subjective, right? And it's up to each individual whether or not they're going to deem something as, let's say, beautiful. I say the same is true for pressure or for experiencing stress, because you and I may be faced with the same exact situation, but have very different views on sort of what that means. And our
Yeah.
our perception of it could be drastically different. And therefore, how it influences us mentally, emotionally, physiologically is going to be very different. And so perception is really where this process begins. And unfortunately, what will tend to happen is that we step into a situation, whether it's, hey, I have a 1 or 2 stroke lead with a few holes to play in the U.S. Open, or I'm in the final set of Wimbledon, with victory on my racket, so to speak. And in those moments, there can be this feeling of like, well, I better not mess it up. Right. And such a shift probably in attention to, thinking about the outcome and, well, what happens now if I fail? The fear of judgment that might come from that. All of that just feels very like threatening to me, to who I am. And that's sort of the story that I'm beginning to tell myself in these moments. And that ultimately is where the pressure is stemming from.
Yeah.
This usually isn't some sort of a conscious, let's say, dialogue that's going on in the head of these individuals, but maybe in the back of our mind, we're sort of weighing, like, do I have the resources to cope with whatever this situation is? And if it's yes, then we probably just keep marching right along. And we sort of maybe lean into the challenge of the situation. We actually even give ourselves an opportunity to potentially experience flow state, which we haven't talked a ton on the podcast about. But when I feel that I have the resources available to meet the challenge of the situation, the intersection of those two things is where flow tends to happen, like kind of being in the zone.
Right.
But if my answer to that question, do I have what it takes? Do I have the resources to cope? If the answer is no, then immediately we shift to pressure, to stress, to feeling overwhelmed.
Yeah, so a couple of things in there I want to follow up on. Well said by you on many levels. That is exactly what happened in the tennis match. Because here's why.
Did Krejcikova tell you that?
Well, not exactly. Let me explain. Because no, she didn't. But a good, fair question. She was the 31 seed. Wasn't supposed to be there. Had never been in a Grand Slam final. It's not far-fetched that she'll never be in another one. Now, she could prove me wrong and go win 20 more of these things, but she wasn't supposed to be there. And when the stakes are that high, and that this literally could be kind of a once-in-a-lifetime type thing, it is extremely difficult to not become overwhelmed with the pressure, right? So I think you're exactly right. Like, her perception of the moment had to be exactly what I just said, of like, wow, I'm not entirely sure how I got here, but I might never be back. And that's a drastically different mentality than what you saw on the men's side, where Novak Djokovic was in the finals. He lost, actually. But he's won 20-something Grand Slams. That's very different. And did he feel pressure? Of course he did. But I highly doubt he felt it in the same way that she did, having won so many of those things in the past. So perception is absolutely huge. And then the other thing I want to follow up on that you said is the asking the question part. We've touched on this in previous podcasts, although in a different subject matter. But the only people who ask that question to themselves are the ones who don't have that. Kobe never asked himself if he had what he needed to cope. Michael Jordan never asked himself if he had Tom Brady, they never asked those questions. As soon as you begin asking the question, do I have what it takes to cope? On some level, you're already acknowledging that you don't.
Yeah.
And to be clear, it's not either you have it or you don't. It's you have it in some degree or measure, right? Yep. It's not there's no threshold you cross and now you officially have enough of it's continuum based for everyone. And those that are asking the question have a less developed, less sophisticated skill set.
Yeah, I think the only other point here, specific to these situations we described with Wimbledon, with the U.S. Open, is there had to have been an intentional shift happening here.
Yep.
To get to this point,
Agreed.
I mean, Wimbledon, how many matches do you have to win even to get to the final? Probably, I don't know, 6?
Yes, I think it's
something
6.
like that.
Yep.
And even to put yourself into a position where now it's the third set and I have an opportunity to win, right? Like, I think that's where the shift probably happened within her mind.
Yeah.
And same with Rory is like, man, you play 70 holes, 69 holes over the course of 4 days. And now with everything right in front of you, that's when you're going to feel the greatest amount of pressure.
For sure you are.
So I think that is a really important piece of these stories, but how quickly that perception can shift.
Yep. All right, so that's what really puts the ball in motion. Perception of the event or the situation, whatever you want to call it, that's what gets us experiencing some internal challenges, right? And so now we're going to transition into talking about the different categories that are commonly experienced for humans when it comes to pressure. And so we're going to break these down, these 3 categories, and go through them, beginning with physical. And so, Cory, we know that when I experience elevated pressure, things begin happening inside of me physiologically or physically that the science has shown. I mean, we're crystal clear on this. Like, we don't wonder what happens to a person who's feeling elevated pressure, elevated stress. Like, we have all the bells and whistles we need to know the answers to that. So let's get into what happens to a human when they feel pressure.
Yeah, this is one where everybody's familiar with it. We've all felt this probably in different capacities. It could be in very different aspects of life. Again, it could be sports. It could be related to school, right? Experiencing like test anxiety, for example.
Sure.
It could be, a big presentation or meeting at work. It could be, asking a guy or a girl out on a date. I mean, any of this. People have probably experienced the physiological response to stress or to pressure.
Yep.
And so what happens, just to at its most basic level, most people have heard of your body's fight or flight response, right? This sort of evolutionarily adaptive system built into human beings or wired into us, where when we detect threat, and we just talked about that, right? We've decided in our mind, okay, we've detected threat, check.
Yep.
So now my body responds accordingly. Like, it activates itself, it kind of kicks itself into high gear. And so that's where the term fight or flight response comes from, is ultimately your body's preparing you to do just that. Either confront, whatever it is that's in front of you, or get the heck out of there. And so specifically what's going on physiologically, this is where you feel that increase in your respiration. So your breathing pattern will shift and change and become more rapid. Your heart rate is probably one that people are very familiar with and feel. The heart rate gets elevated, your blood pressure goes up. The stress hormone cortisol is released at this point. Adrenaline kicks in. So you do feel a burst of almost energy because your body, again, is getting amped up.
Yeah.
People feel different variations, like when it comes to your muscles. So some people feel tense or get very stiff. Other people feel poor muscle coordination because they're kind of jittery or shaky. If you've ever had that experience of, your hand shaking, for example.
These are the shaking hands trying to grip the putter on the green.
Correct.
We've seen examples of this in people trying to win their first major.
I mean, the pit in your stomach, the butterflies that you might feel, right? The sweating that can occur. All of that is your body's response. Actually, a really interesting one that some people might not be aware of, but is really, really relevant in the world of sports, is your visual field actually narrows.
Yep. Because
essentially it's like you're trying to hone in on whatever, let's say 10,000 years ago, the tiger that's trying to eat you, or you're finding your escape route. But that's really relevant for the world of sports. So all of those things are happening. Essentially, it's like the pressure is now kind of hijacked my body. Again, I've determined I don't have the resources to cope with this. Everything kicks into high gear. Physiologically, you can see how that can solve some problems in the world of sports, where you tend to need coordination and timing, and you need to utilize your body and be in control of it. So that's what's happening under pressure.
Yeah, and it's exactly as you detailed that long list, and it is a really long list of the things that happen to us physiologically. Like, think about the collision of all of that is happening to me, and yet the moment I'm in as an athlete is demanding elite fine motor, like elite fine motor coordination and skill activation, execution. You talk about extraordinarily difficult, and then let's go back to with one of the stats you listed earlier with Rory. You said 495 out of 495?
Yeah, something along those lines.
And so, an easy low-hanging fruit type question would be, how can he miss that? Well, think about what we just said. If all of those things are going on inside of me and I'm trying to grab a putter and hit what is, for me, frankly, an easy putt, how do you miss an easy putt? Well, you have all these things going on.
Yeah, and that's just the physiological piece.
We haven't even got the rest of it. Yeah. But so I'm trying to overcome a body that is in fight or flight mode and is reacting and overreacting to my perception of what I think is going on here.
Correct.
So when I heard the shouts across the living room of, "Oh my gosh, she is choking so bad," why does it look like there's like literally a different person wearing this woman's uniform for this match? Because this is happening, right? Okay, so great description by you. The only thing I would add to that is, as we get into talking about these other categories, the visual image that I think would be great for our listeners to think about would be a snowball rolling down a hill. And we've used this example in talking about the role of pressure and stress before, but imagine like, okay, this ball is now in motion and it's rolling down the hill. And the last thing I'd say on this before we transition, Cory, is let's apply this to the person who's doing public speaking. Because I think, like you said, not everyone on here is going to be playing golf or playing tennis or anything like that. And if you ever wonder why you need that like bottle of water to take up there with you to do your public speaking thing, if you ever wonder why you're going, like although you told yourself to slow down and not talk too fast, why are you talking so fast? These are some of the reasons why.
Yep, exactly. So why don't we shift this? And I've been doing a lot of talking here. We'll shift over to you. Talk about, I guess we'll start with the mental response to pressure, but what's going on between the ears?
A whole bunch. Did you want more detail than that?
Well,
okay. Yeah, let's talk about that because there is a whole bunch going on. And beginning with one of the things we know about human beings is that when it comes to kind of our mental makeup and that internal dialogue, the psychological jargon would call that self-talk. But when we get into thinking about the self-talk of humans, the science is really, really clear in that our brains are incredibly active and sophisticated to the tune of somewhere between 50,000 to 70,000 thoughts a day is what your brain is processing, which is quite a few, obviously. And although we're already processing so many thoughts on a normal day that doesn't include pressure and stress being elevated, when we have an experience or a series of experiences where stress and pressure are elevated, the mind goes even faster. So if you can get that image in your head of, we've all seen kind of a hamster running on a wheel at some point in life, this is where the hamster who was already jogging is no longer jogging and is now sprinting. And so the first issue we got to start with is just frequency of the number of thoughts that we are producing and kind of spitting out in our brains rapidly increases from a quantity standpoint. And what is that? What's the translation of that to the person who's experiencing these thinking patterns? Is noise. For lack of a better term, things get really, really noisy in our minds. And so when you hear someone say like, gosh, when the pressure's on, you've got to just focus and you've got to clear your mind and you've got to be able to just calm yourself down. Why is that so difficult? Well, one of the reasons it's difficult is because the hamster just took off. And now the hamster's sprinting. So that's the first part, is that thought frequency. What else do we know happens there?
Yeah, I mean, again, I've already interpreted something to be threatening, right? That's my perception of the situation. I don't have the resources. So there's this seed of negativity has been planted. Those thoughts tend to just sort of follow suit. And it's almost like we take that seed of doubt and now we're just watering it.
Yep.
We're giving it everything
Bingo.
it needs to grow. And so that negativity is not great. Again, talk about the moments that we're discussing here. You sprinkle some negativity in, the doubt, the worry, the concern, the do I have what it takes, all of that just becomes louder and louder. It's like the volume is just getting turned up slowly
Right.
on that part of your self-talk, I guess.
And now let's make a connection here too, right? Because let's not forget what we talked about a few moments ago related to the physiological stuff. So my heart is already beating really fast. My breathing is becoming more labored, right? I'm sweating because I'm feeling so much pressure. Now my mind is racing. And I can tell you this, the more the mind races, that isn't exactly helping my heart rate go down.
Mm-hmm.
Isn't exactly helping my breathing, respiration improve.
Yeah, these things it's a vicious cycle to get caught in.
Correct.
Because once you become aware, it's interesting when you actually talk to performers in different areas, they're often very conscious of one and maybe not so much the other one,
Mm-hmm.
but pretty quickly they become conscious of the other.
Yep.
So, it might be, hey, I'm very aware of just my thoughts are all over the place. I'm having a hard time like focusing or concentrating. And then what comes next is I realize then how elevated my heart is, right? And how, I'm kind of jittery or I'm shaky or whatever.
Yep.
Well, what do you think that does to your thoughts?
Correct.
They're only going to get worse.
So now my thoughts are becoming like, oh my gosh, it's getting worse. I'm not going to be able to fix this. What's going to happen because I can't fix this? Well, now, boom, what is that ping? Now my heart's beating even faster. Now my palms are getting even sweatier. Well, what does that translate to? I just made another type of execution mistake of some type, right? So now what's happening? Well, now there go my thoughts. So there's the snowball.
Mm-hmm.
Now the snowball's picking up steam. It's going faster. It's getting larger. The pressure's building.
I think the example of public speaking here is real too. So imagine all of this is happening and I'm standing in front of the room and I'm speaking and I notice I just start looking out into the audience and I see the facial expressions and how in my head I'm like, man, this so-and-so, are they even paying attention? Like, do they think I'm a fraud? This and that.
That guy's on his phone.
I trip over my words a little bit. Now it's like I start moving even faster. I can feel the heart rate going up. Like, so not just in sports, but to use that example, I felt that, man.
Someone who's listening to this is now sweating.
Probably just driving in their car, yeah.
Because they've lived that.
Their workout just got exceptionally faster because they're just thinking about it.
Or they've got an upcoming speaking thing in the next week or so, and we just upped the ante on it for them. So, so just one more point here I want to make on the mental side that I think is really important is the thinking pattern changes that we're talking about become extremely disruptive of focus. And so what do we know about the greater the pressure is? In all likelihood, that's happening because the moment you're in is a high stakes, high importance type moment. What do we know about those types of moments? They almost always require optimal focus in order to be successful. And so as you kind of pull that apart a little bit, I now have less than optimal focus in this key peak type moment. My mind is racing and my body is sending all these signals to me that are telling me I'm not quite prepared for this. Mm-hmm. It's not hard to see and understand why people see what we call and what the literature says would be performance impairment.
Yeah. Yeah. And one more note there on the focus piece. People don't usually use these words, but if you read between the line, you have enough of these conversations like you and I have. It's amazing how a lot of the focus related to whatever the task is, whether it's playing tennis or golf or giving a speech, it shifts big time to uncontrollable stuff.
Yep, bingo.
Right. So the outcome in sports is the easiest one. And like I mentioned, even with the speech example, it's like now I'm so concerned about my read on everybody else's, their body language and their facial expressions and, are they paying attention and this and that? Again, I can't control that, but that's what I become fixated on.
Yep.
That doesn't help matters. And one other piece here, there's plenty of research that shows that once this process has sort of begun, our working memory is sort of hijacked. And so now if you think about why decision-making happens or why, errors can occur, is like we're not even able to fully tap into, our working memory to draw on the knowledge that we have or the ability that we have or whatever.
Which is why you come off that stage frustrated because you didn't say what you said you were going to say.
Correct.
Oh, I forgot that example I was going to bring up. I forgot that quote I was going to mention. Like, yeah, because you can't go find that file to pull because your working memory is impaired, which I think has a direct link to cortisol. I think the cortisol really kind of destroys that. All right, so let's get into the third one here, Corey. So we've talked about physical, we've talked about mental. The third and final part of this framework that pressure really disrupts is the emotional side. And so when we say the emotional piece of this, start this off for us and kind of get into what are some of the factors of this.
Well, I think just starting with the emotions that we tend to experience, and it's amazing how quickly, again, these emotions will shift. It's like I'm going from, just feeling in this, I guess, emotional state of like, I'm enjoying the competition. It's fun. I'm out here, like I'm competing, and I love that challenge. And, just sort of embracing the opportunity that's in front of me, all of those things very quickly now because of this process, because I've decided to experience, the pressure of the situation, to anxious and fearful, frustrated, irritable, sort of distraught, disappointed, like on a dime now.
Yeah.
It's like everything has gone from what maybe was positive or just a neutral emotional state, which is completely fine and probably a great place for a lot of performers to be.
Yep.
But very, very clearly negative at this point.
Yep. It's not hard to see why Rory stormed out of the clubhouse.
Correct.
When this all was over. I mean, he became really, really emotional. So emotional. Yeah, those are all the ones you just listed are common emotions that people experience when they're in these high pressure moments. And, why is that? Because when you're not coping with the pressure and stress well, it's almost a sure thing that you're going to see some negative performance outcomes occurring, which are obvious triggers for these emotions, right? Like if I'm losing, if it's a tennis match, if I'm losing games, I'm going to become increasingly frustrated and irritable and anxious. Mm-hmm. If I'm up giving the public speaking deal, like you mentioned, and I'm stumbling over my words and I'm getting negative feedback from the audience about their interest and approval of what I'm doing, I'm going to get increasingly anxious and scared's probably a little bit of a strong word there, but I wouldn't rule it out. Yeah. I mean, people could become scared of finishing the talk. They probably will finish it, but
probably scared of the repercussions.
Yeah, it could be. That's a good point. That's a good point. So these things are closely linked. And then the other thing that's I think it's important to touch on here is there are specific emotional behaviors that commonly pop up either during or after or both these things. So like if you look in sports, why do people, when the pressure, like why do you see athletes shouting at teammates, shouting at coaches, getting irate, getting irritable? Well, those are common behaviors. Mm-hmm. The other thing that you'll see oftentimes is blaming and excuse making. Mm-hmm. It's way easier for many people who suffer some type of embarrassing performance setback to blame somebody else or make excuses.
Yep. Yeah, I think in golf, and I'm certainly not going to say this about Rory. I don't know if this happened or not, but this is where you could see, for example, the interaction now between the golfer and the caddy starts to change.
Yeah, good point.
Because he's looking at him like, man, I should have known, right? The putt was doing this.
Give me better information.
How could you not tell me that? Like that kind of thing. You mentioned the tennis piece, and I actually heard some dialogue recently about, current day tennis players, how reliant they are on like their coaches. So imagine now all of these things are happening, and I'm in this high pressure situation. Well, they're very aware of where the coach is in the stands.
Yep.
And how now after every point they're looking over
Look in
to
the box.
see like what's coach have to say, all of that, those behaviors, like you mentioned, just driven by the emotion of the situation, where if you just turn back the clock an hour in the match,
Yep.
that wasn't happening, but at least to that extent.
Bingo.
So that's where things I think are really, really fascinating. Again, just the interaction of all these things too, as we described. Most people's response to feeling the pressure, most people I say, is to speed up. Everything kind of gets fast. So the golfer is going to walk faster. They're going to go through their routine faster. And to be honest, a lot of them start to swing faster.
Yeah, they do.
Right?
Absolutely.
So think about how that might even change the putting stroke, which is this short little graceful stroke. But if it's just a little bit quicker and kind of jumpy, it's going to influence the shot. So I think even the example of the speech, right, is like, hey, I've practiced this in front of the mirror 1,000 times. I always go between 10 and 12 minutes, and then today I finished in 8.
Yeah.
Well, that's because everything's sped up, right? You talk
Yes.
faster and so on. It's just the interaction of the physiological, the mental, the emotional, all of those things is a pretty vicious cycle to get caught in when it comes to performance. So,
one last piece I want to touch on here for behavior before we, or emotion, sorry, before we move forward is one of the more unfortunate things that can happen due to this emotional piece is people making decisions they regret. It's easy to allow the emotion to push you to a place of compromised decisions that end up sometimes, unfortunately, being really problematic decisions. And not all of them are as costly as others, obviously, but this is where a person can really make some errors in judgment, unfortunately, that they later regret. And some of those they can kind of go back and maybe rectify, and others you simply can't.
Yeah.
And so it highlights the importance of, you're exactly right about the fact that we speed up so much. Ideally, in a perfect world, we would have a little bit of an internal governor where we could slow ourselves down. The slower you go when it comes to navigating decisions in these situations, almost always the better off you are.
Yeah, so let's shift to, just real quick, I'll kind of summarize. I mentioned sort of the interaction of these things and how it can influence performance and why performance problems end up persisting when we experience this pressure. So we hit on the disturbances in muscle coordination and timing, primarily driven by the physiological response.
Yeah.
Rushing, which we just talked about, like everything just kind of speeds up. Combine that with the inability to attend to task-relevant cues. So that could be, for example, Rory's just, it's almost like, man, he's done this 1,000 times or 1,000,000 times, but he's not paying attention to the grain of the putt, or, the grain of the grass in the putt.
Yeah.
It could be you've got the note cards right in front of you when you're delivering that speech, but it's almost like
you don't even look down.
You're not even looking down,
Yeah.
right? Or they kind of start to just blend together. You're skipping over bullets, like whatever. Fatigue and muscle tightness, if we're talking sport primarily here. But again, your body's not intended to be in this state of high arousal for too long.
Yep.
So imagine you can actually do this driving in your car or whatever. Take your fist and clench it, and what would be like 100%, we're not talking about that, but clench it just, 50%, 30%. And now imagine staying like that for the next 3 or 4 hours with that level of tension. Like at some point, your body, your muscles just get exhausted. They wear out.
Yep.
The anticipation and decision-making errors that can occur, we hit on that. Again, my mind's just not in the right place. I'm not focused on the right things. And so I'm missing things that normally or otherwise I'd be hitting on. Lastly, I think for some people, there's a hesitation or a timid miss. It's like, even if I'm delivering the speech, I'm not delivering it with conviction. Like I'm saying the words, but there's almost a timidness about it where it's almost like I don't even believe in it, right? Or to use a soccer phrase, which probably the first time that's ever come out of my mouth, like it's almost
Do
like,
you mean football? I'm sorry.
Yeah, like playing on the back foot, so to speak, right? Where
it's
we're
good
almost,
language though.
I'm almost now just reacting to everything as opposed to feeling like on the front foot and dictating how things are going.
You better hope Coach Noonan does not hear this podcast.
but the interaction, the interplay of all of those different variables, the physiological, the mental, the emotional, that's why performance issues are happening. Yeah. So that probably cleared up a ton for the people listening in their mind around just like some experiences that they've had and why maybe things went south. That tends to be the reaction we get when we, deliver this talk to people in person. But we're not just going to cut it off there.
Yeah, this has been let's call it doom and gloom. Let's be honest.
Just like, all right, guys, see you next time.
Doom and gloom here, but hey,
project.
we're not going to end that way.
Figure it out on your own.
Good luck. No, we won't do that to them. But the last thing I want to say before we get into this is when you put all those puzzle pieces together, and there's a phrase we talk about a lot, and whether it doesn't really matter the industry, but the 1% of the 1%. Why do we hold those people in such high esteem? It's because they have figured out how to still execute despite all of that. They have figured out how when the moment is, what I always say is it demands your competitive best, you have the skill set, mindset needed to meet and overcome. Mm-hmm. And that's why we talk about these people in such high esteem. Certainly in my mind, they deserve it. So yeah, you're right though. We can't end here. That wouldn't really feel right. So let's kind of close our conversation today, Corey, talking about like, despite all of the complexities we've just spent time kind of outlining here, what can we do? Like, what are the best practices available to us that we know give people the best possible chance to be successful and perform at a high level while under pressure?
Yeah, I think, again, we went through this stepwise for a reason. And so if you think about where it starts with perception. So the best thing that people can learn how to do is have a better appraisal.
Yeah,
you used that word
that's
earlier.
Key.
A better appraisal or a better perception of what pressure, of what stress is. The word there, I guess the psychology term would be like reframe it, sort of change the narrative in your mind, or more specifically, like a positive stress appraisal.
Yep. But you can't do that on the fly.
No. And so most people, again, you can anticipate pressure. Like if you're paying attention at all.
Yeah, of course you can.
Right? If you're in the professional world, like that big meeting or that big presentation is coming up.
Right.
Like it's not sneaking up on you. Right? If it is, then yeah, you're probably going to experience some of these things. I hope you learn from it and you'll be better next time. But a lot of the time, like that's scheduled out. And you know yourself well enough to be able to say like, hey, this is going to get some juice flowing, right?
Yep.
So ahead of time, I need to make the decision and decide how am I going to approach this situation. I remember, I'll give a couple examples here, just like personal examples even, of when I've had to apply all of these things.
I almost forgot we had to get to these. Here we go.
So I remember the very first time I went out to talk to Oregon football, right? I had talked to football teams before. I've talked to plenty of college teams before, but it felt a little different
because it was
going out there. The team meeting room is so awesome, but so intimidating.
I bet.
Like if you're not kind of prepared for it. So what I made sure to do is like number one, and I did this recently too. I had the opportunity to talk to, I think my first ever like professional sports team, and just knowing myself and anticipating like, man, I'm going to be so kind of juiced up for this. I've got to make the decision really early on how I want to approach it. So for both of these situations, it was one where I would almost like, hey, a week out, if I just think about it, like, hey, what am I going to talk to when I get in front of that group? I'd already start to feel like the juice, right? So in my mind, I just kept saying like, man, I'm so excited. Like, I'm so excited to do this. Like, this is everything I've kind of worked towards. This is exactly what I want to be doing. Like, this is going to be a lot of fun.
Right.
So my interpretation of everything that I was feeling internally, even some of the thoughts, the jitters, right, of around how is it going to go and this and that, I just kept telling myself like, how cool is this?
Yep.
Essentially.
Yep. Which let me say one thing. I'm going to hear your next one. And I've heard you say that, by the way, because I remember it was awesome. But think about the difference between these two mentalities of this is so exciting. I'm so excited to do this versus I better not blow this.
Right.
You know?
Yeah.
I mean, like the person who's telling themselves or kind of stumbling through this mental space of like, I might not get 2 of these. I better not blow it. There's a lot on the line here. That's vastly different from, I've worked a long time for this. This is exciting. I can't wait to go do this.
Mm-hmm. So that is, I would say, is just the overarching, like that was the perspective coming in, was just, this is cool. This is great. This is exciting. I want to do this. And then embracing a little bit then of some of even what I was feeling internally, some of the physiological stuff. Both these circumstances, what I tried to do was get into the physical space as soon as I could.
100%.
Just to sort of acclimate to it,
feel and familiarize.
Yeah. So Oregon football, I got in there early just to stand in front of the room and see what it was like. Mm-hmm. I did this with the professional team as well, and then from there it was all these other things that we can hit on. But
let me mention one thing there too, because we've I've had my share of that. Right, mm-hmm. I've definitely had my share of first in the speaking realm. I remember. The first time I did like a big national sales meeting keynote. So I'm talking like, I mean, I know this one specifically, there was about 2,000 people there.
Oof.
Yeah.
I haven't done that yet.
So the first time I did that years ago, I was feeling it. It was a little nerve wracking. But here's a best practice that I know we both do that helped me a ton that day is, so I think feel and familiarity is a huge thing. It's always really, really important to get in the space, ideally day before. You can't always do that. But to get in the space and start to develop feel for the space is a big deal. And then the other one I'll share that helps a bunch, and this is all to alleviate pressure, is the more connection you can create with the people. And so like in a room of 2,000 people, that's tougher to do. But what I like to do for smaller rooms is like I'm sure that I'm there early, so that as people are coming into the room, I can get like as many possible connections as possible. So I'm shaking hands, I'm greeting people, I'm asking them questions. I'm like getting into the moment with them and establishing even just brief connections with them. And that's just fueling, I'm creating connection and familiarity and kind of like we're in this thing together. Mm-hmm. Like you got to always remember, they want you to do well. Like they're there to get something out of it. And so you truly are in this thing together, and that people are hoping you present and execute in a way that they can benefit from it.
Yeah. Yeah. Well said. The other piece that I was going to mention, and this is something that I've, done sort of practice or whatever for years. Number one, with the professional team, I woke up a few minutes early and actually just meditated to help like clear my head a little bit. And we had done research years ago out at Clemson, actually, with some technology. And what we found was that on game days, okay, regardless of sport, regardless of gender, right, on game day, when student athletes were waking up in the morning, let's say it's 8 a.m., right, for a oftentimes afternoon or evening competition,
right,
their heartbeats were about 10 beats higher, just because it was game day, right? So knowing really that about myself, right, just wake up, like, essentially first thing, like, get myself dressed and then just sit and, like, kind of wipe the slate clean, like, calm my mind a little bit. But then getting into the moment is when you really start to feel some of the juice. So now I'm in the space. Now people are starting to trickle in and I'm saying hello and, exchanging pleasantries. Like, man, I'm sitting there breathing.
Good.
I'm trying to just kind of slow the situation down. My tendency to, like most people, or like many people, is going to be to speed up and just talk fast. So very, very deliberately trying to slow myself down and make sure that I'm under control, even with how I start the presentation and how quickly I'm getting through things and so on. So those were a couple of the very tangible, real things that I was trying to do.
That's good.
For some of these, personal examples.
Okay, couple last things here of what to do. Perspective taking and perspective reframing is huge in these situations. And I'll share a quick story that highlights that. I've told this at least once on the podcast, although it was a long time ago. Years and years ago, I'll never forget this. This is over a decade ago, maybe 15 years ago. I'm at a conference in St. Louis. It was a national sports psychology conference. We've been to a bunch of these. And the keynote speaker for this conference was an individual who was a longtime military performance psychologist. He had done a lot of what we do, but strictly in military settings. And so he gets up to start his talk, and he says to the audience, before I get started, there's one very important thing I need to mention. And I'm thinking like, well, this is interesting. What's he going to say next? And keep in mind, in that room, there were really, although more than two, most of the individuals in that room did one of two things. They either worked primarily in the military settings or they worked primarily in sports settings. And there were a few stragglers, but most people were one of those two things. And so this is what he says. He says, to those of you in the room who work primarily in sports context or sports settings, I need you to understand that everything we do in the military is infinitely more important than anything you'll ever do in sports. And you've heard me tell this story before, and it's a great story. It was fascinating to me how many sport-type people in the room got offended. Like they did.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, they got offended by that. I'm not saying like I'm a great, perfect person, but I didn't, and I couldn't have agreed more. And so I think one of the things that we've got to remember in pressure situations, whether they are sports, whether they are business, is if it doesn't go quite like we wanted it to, it's almost a sure thing that the true like foundations and priorities of things in life that we hold dear are still going to be there.
Yep.
Rory didn't win the U.S. Open. And I've got a feeling he has still got family and friends that love him. He still has a career that he gets to be a part of. And there are more opportunities down the road. Mm-hmm. And I think that perspective taking, particularly in moments of high pressure, is critical.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess the final pieces from me, going back to even the interpretation or how you're kind of framing things up for yourself. I'd be remiss to not mention this because I do think it's really important. It can be really, really helpful. I describe this as like normalizing the situation.
Uh-huh.
And so if we go back to some of the examples that I described or used, it would be just kind of reminding myself that this is the same talk or pieces of it, let's say, right? It's the same knowledge that I've been teaching and utilizing and sharing for 10 years.
Yeah.
It's a different population sitting in front of me, but otherwise, this is the same.
Hoosiers. This is where you want to talk about Hoosiers, right?
Not a Hoosiers guy, but yeah, I mean, for Rory, for the putt, right? It's like, hey, this is just another 4-foot putt. This is just another round of golf, as opposed to like, oh my gosh, I have an opportunity to win a major, right? Or for the tennis example, the Wimbledon example, of like, hey, this is just another set. Like, let's just keep doing what we're doing, kind of thing. Like, you're not making the situation bigger than what it needs to be.
Yep.
And sort of shrinking it back down to scale of like, hey, this is still what I do every day.
Right.
So if you're delivering a speech, if you're giving a presentation, it's probably because like you were selected to do that for a reason. Mm-hmm. Like you have the knowledge, you have everything that you need to be effective. It's just a matter of reminding yourself of that.
Yeah. Yeah, if you've got a 4-foot putt to win, whether it's the Open or whatever, keep in mind that like 100 and something other guys weren't good enough to be in that moment. Mm-hmm. Like there's a reason why you have this on your club right now, and it means you've done a heck of a lot of things right over the course of the week. Okay, so man, we covered a lot of ground there.
We did.
And I think, why is that? I think it's because this is a topic that is generalizable to everyone. And yet it is complex. If you, as you've kind of been listening to this, have some type of history and relate to this of like, you know what, I've had some pressure type moments that didn't go real well and I didn't manage them very effectively, consider yourself like the rest of us, normal. And it's because it is tough. But hopefully this conversation today is one that you can use as a valuable resource to help you in your path forward and on your project, your growth path of trying to get better. So with that, we'll wrap up for today. We always like to ask if you do find our podcast helpful for your life, you can find us on both Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Always appreciate a review. Let us know how we're doing and how we can continue to serve you better going forward. Thanks so much.